Welcome back to our channel, CSIA Podcast. Today we will discuss about terrorism, global terrorism. We know that terrorism is a major threat to international peace and security. Today, Admiral Ponto will brief us to give assessment on global terrorism and the future terrorism, especially in our region and our country, Indonesia. Welcome, Admiral.
Thank you very much, sir. Nice to meet you.
Admiral Ponto is a former Chief of Intelligence T9.
Thank you, Bung Aryan, for having me here to talking about the terrorism around the world and terrorism in Indonesia also. Okay? Terrorism. So, after 9/11 incident, terrorism became one of the main problems in the UN Security Council because of its implication for international peace and security. In this case, globalization also plays a role in expanding to chain of global terrorism, considering that it is increasingly easy to establish communication across region coupled with increasing development of weapon technology. The COVID-19 pandemic as a global phenomenon has also had influence on global terrorism trends. Various acts of terrorism which have become a dark record through history have made the UN Security Council act decisively by giving it the obligation to make a report every 6 months regarding the movement of global acts terrorism. Starting from there, it is interesting to review the dynamic of global terrorism and its development, especially in Indonesia, as well as the effort made to overcome in this action. Even though the COVID-19 pandemic limits the space for movement and communication between terrorist networks, this doesn't mean that the threat of terrorism has simply disappeared. Restriction imposed due to the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia are not in conflict area indeed, beside to hinder the movement, action and threats of terrorism. However, different things happen to the country in conflict zone. The threat of terrorism has actually increased in the conflict area. Another problem related to acts of terrorism is the use of the internet as a medium that makes it easier to recruit and spread terrorism. This increasing threat also encourages refugees to fly, such as in camps in Syria and Iraq. In terms of raising funds to support that action, terrorist groups utilize cryptocurrency and illegal gold mining as alternative sources of funding in pandemic situation. At the start of this pandemic, USNC issued Security Council Resolution 2532 as a push for a global ceasefire. But this resolution doesn't apply to fighting terrorism. Even though the level of global terrorism has decreased in the pandemic era, the UN Secretary General continues to report the threat of ISIS to international peace and security. Countries are reminded to remain alert to the threat of terrorism. In July 2020, the Executive Directorate of the UN Counter-Terrorism Committee issued a policy text that looked at the potential threat of terrorism during pandemic from both sides, both short-term and long-term risks. The expected short-term risk is that large audiences are captivated by the internet, providing opportunity for terrorist groups to expand their propaganda narratives and act as alternative service providers. Meanwhile, the long-term risk is that there will be pressure on resources for eradicating terrorism, which will shift to effort to control the spread of COVID-19. As an effort to eradicate terrorism, the UN is holding Counter-Terrorism Week in May 2021 with an emphasis on several strategic issues which are considered increasingly significant in the landscape of global terrorism problem, namely effort to restore area abandoned by ISIS, handling foreign terrorists, handling fighters and members, his family, including the increasing threat of terrorism in Africa, the emergence of new terrorism threats based on xenophobia, racism, misogyny, and other forms of intolerance which give birth to lone wolves. Apart from that, the use of technology in the COVID-19 pandemic situation also raises three main challenges for counter-terrorism action, namely the possibility of cyber attack, the use of cryptocurrency, and crowdfunding as funding resources, and the use of artificial intelligence, printing, and drones by terrorist groups to carry out their action. In the South Asia region itself, a trend of terrorism has emerged in the form of the use of suicide bombs, using women as perpetrators of terrorist crime, where this trend is increasingly occurring in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. For example, in Indonesia itself, throughout 2016 until 2020, 14 women were arrested on suspicion of being perpetrators of act of terrorism. Not only that, the trend of self-radicalization online in the form of lone wolf attacks is also making it increasingly difficult for law enforcement officials to detect their potential attacks. According to 2020 Global Terrorism Index, GTI, Indonesia is ranked 37 in the category of countries with moderate impact and is ranked 42 based on 2021 Global Peace Index, which shows that Indonesia is a country with high level of terrorism. Methods of funding act of terrorism in Indonesia continue to develop generally utilized charity and donation boxes, fundraising under the guise of local business, selling personal assets, and crowdfunding by individuals working abroad. Apart from that, the funding mode also creates new threats that take advantage of corporations selling illegal drugs, virtual assets, and online loans. Seeing the rise of illegal fundraising, the Indonesian government then issued Law Number 9 of 2013 as the basic regulatory instrument that blocks the financing of terrorism group. The Israel-Hamas conflict is very likely to influence the development of terrorism, both international terrorism and domestic terrorism. Cells that have been sleeping can wake up again if they feel there is injustice in their treatment, especially toward Hamas. If we look at the development of terrorism in Indonesia, one of the conflicts that has driven act of terrorism is the separatist movement and the action of armed criminal group in Papua or KKB, which has resulted in hundreds of civilian and military police casualties. BNPT or National Counterterrorism Agency then pushed for a paradigm shift in eradicating terrorism, where it was felt that the use of criminal code could no longer be used as the sole basis for this problem. This is because the criminal code does not contain regulation regarding the prosecution of groups or organizations and doesn't reflect the principle of upholding human rights, but only accommodates individual as legal subject. Therefore, BNPT is more inclined in encourage the use of Law Number 5 of 2018 and Law Number 9 of 2013 as an effort to enforce the law more firmly. As for Law Number 5, 2018, among other things, defines that KKB as an organized group that commits serious crime and includes acts of terrorism and has elements that uphold human rights. Meanwhile, Law Number 9 of 2013 include blocking terrorism funding. Based on discussion above, it can be seen that the international world cannot close its eyes to the dynamic of global terrorism. Massive technological development due to globalization are actually like two sides of coin, where one side it can have a good impact, and on the other side it can have a bad impact. Regarding acts of terrorism, the negative impact caused by globalization is the facilitates the spread of global terrorism network, and the modus operandi of terrorism is increasingly varied and modern. The COVID-19 pandemic has also played a role in influencing this global terrorism trend. Even though the situation resulting from the pandemic seems to limit the space for terrorism to carry out their action, in reality, the threat of terrorism is actually increasing in countries located in conflict-prone areas. Therefore, the international community must always alert to all forms of threats and terrorism problem that could have an impact on international security and peace, including Indonesia. Even though it is said to be a country with a medium impact and has a high level of peace, Indonesia must also remain alert to various potential threats of terrorism. It is hoped that change in the paradigm for eradicating terrorism carried out by BNPT will make future effort to eradicate terrorism in Indonesia more firm and effective in cracking down on all modus operandi of terrorism, especially KKB in Papua. That's all. Thank you very much.